The call came in on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. Diane Portfield made it from her kitchen window, standing with her coffee going cold at her hand, watching the old truck across the street the way a person watches something they have decided is an offense before they have fully articulated why. It was parked legally. It was not blocking anything. It had not made a sound since it arrived the previous evening, but it was old and it was unpolished, and it sat in front of number 14, Maple Glen Drive, like something that had wandered in from a different neighborhood entirely and hadn't noticed it didn't belong. Diane set down her coffee and called the Maple Glen Homeowners Association. The truck was a 1973 Ford F-100, dark green, or what had once been dark green. The decades had softened the color into something closer to the shade of old pine, a color that had stopped trying to be impressive and had become simply itself. The chrome on the bumper was honest rust, not decoration. The side mirror on the driver's side had been replaced at some point with one that didn't quite match. The bed had a thin layer of dust from a long drive and a small wooden toolbox bolted near the cab that looked like it had been made by hand. It was, by any objective measure, a well-maintained old truck. The tires were good. The engine, as the neighbors who had been home the previous evening could confirm, had turned over cleanly and shut down without complaint. It simply looked like a working vehicle from another era, parked on a street where the average car cost more than most people's annual salary and was washed on Saturdays with a focused attention usually reserved for religious practice. The man who had parked it was not visible. He had walked up the path to number 14, unlocked the door, and gone inside without looking around. No wave to the neighbors, no acknowledgement of the street. Just a man coming home after a long time away, doing it quietly. Number 14. Maple Glen Drive had been on the street for 11 years. The man who owned it had bought it in cash, renovated the interior with care, and spent perhaps 40 weeks of those 11 years actually living in it. The rest of the time he was elsewhere, working, traveling, existing in the particular peripatetic way of a person whose professional life happens in many places, and whose home is the thing he returns to rather than the thing he performs. The neighbors who had been there long enough knew him. The newer ones mostly knew of him. Everyone on Maple Glen Drive knew the name Keanu Reeves, though most of them had the quiet social grace not to make a production of it. Diane Portfield had moved in 3 years ago. She had introduced herself to Keanu exactly once, a brief exchange at the end of the driveway in which she had said she was a big fan, and he had thanked her warmly and asked how she was settling in. She had told 3 people about the conversation. She had also, in the 3 years since, called the HOA twice about his property. Once about a tree branch she felt was overhanging the street at an unacceptable angle. Once about the recycling bins being left at the curb an extra day after collection. Both times the HOA had investigated and found no violation. The third call, the one about the truck, she made with the confidence of a woman who had been right twice and had not yet updated her understanding of her record. The Maple Glen Homeowners Association had been established 22 years ago by the original developer of the street, a man named Gerhardt, who had strong opinions about property values and landscape uniformity, and had built both into the founding documents with the fervor of someone legislating a vision. Over the decades, the vision had calcified into something more procedural, a set of rules maintained less out of genuine community investment and more out of institutional momentum. The board met monthly. Violations were logged, fines were issued, appeals were heard, and occasionally granted by a committee of 3 whose enthusiasm for the process varied considerably. The current board president was a man named Leonard Fitch, 58, retired financial consultant, a person who had spent 3 decades making decisions about other people's money and had transferred that authority, upon retirement, to decisions about other people's front gardens. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one, which in the context of HOA governance produced many of the same outcomes. He believed in the rules not because he had examined them and found them worthy, but because rules, in his experience, were what separated organized communities from chaos, and chaos was something Leonard Fitch had spent his entire professional life billing clients to avoid. He received Diane's complaint at 9:03 a.m. He read it twice. He pulled up the relevant section of the community guidelines, Section 7, Subsection C, Vehicles, and found, as he had suspected, that the guidelines did not actually prohibit street parking of roadworthy vehicles in good condition. What they prohibited was the storage of inoperable, unregistered, or visually deteriorated vehicles on any property surface visible from the street, including but not limited to driveways, side yards, and the public road immediately adjacent to the property. He looked at the complaint again. Diane had described the truck as an eyesore inconsistent with neighborhood standards and likely unregistered given its apparent age and condition. Leonard pulled up the section on enforcement protocol. He was not going to send an inspector based on a neighbor's aesthetic opinion, but he was also not going to do nothing. He sent a standard inquiry email to his HOA inspector, a man named Gary Pelham, asking him to do a drive-by when convenient and report back on whether the vehicle in question presented any documentable violation. Gary Pelham drove by at 11:15 a.m. He parked his own car 2 houses down, walked along the footpath, and looked at the truck the way a man looks at something he's been asked to find fault with and is genuinely trying. He walked around it once. He looked at the tires. He checked the registration sticker on the plate. Current, valid, up to date. He looked at the body for any structural damage that might indicate an inoperable vehicle. He found none. The truck was old. It was worn. It was, in Gary's private opinion, a beautiful example of a vehicle that had been cared for honestly over a long period of time, the kind of truck his own father had driven for 30 years in rural Oregon, and which Gary had learned to drive and on a gravel road at age 15. He took 3 photographs as per protocol, wrote his notes, and drove back to his office. His report to Leonard Fitch was 4 sentences long. The vehicle is registered and current. It shows no signs of structural damage or inoperability. It is parked legally on the public road. There is no documentable violation under Section 7, subsection C, or any other section of the community guidelines. Leonard sent Diane a politely worded email explaining that no violation had been found. Diane read the email, set down her coffee again, and called Leonard directly. The call lasted 14 minutes. Leonard had handled difficult HOA members for 7 years and had developed a particular tone for these conversations, measured, procedural, not unkind, but absolute in its adherence to what the documentation actually said. Diane cycled through several positions. The truck was an eyesore. The truck was bringing down property values. The truck was not in keeping with the character of the neighborhood. Leonard acknowledged each concern and returned, each time, to the same point. The guidelines addressed specific, documentable violations. Aesthetic disagreement was not among them. When the call ended, Diane stood at her kitchen window again and looked at the truck. It looked back at her, or seemed to, in a way that inanimate objects become charged when they are the subject of strong feeling. Old green paint, honest rust, the small wooden toolbox in the bed. She decided to speak to Keanu directly. She crossed the street at 2 p.m. She had changed into a different blouse, which she told herself was coincidental. She rang the bell at number 14 and waited. For a moment, she thought he wasn't home. Then the door opened. He was in a plain gray t-shirt and old jeans, hair slightly damp, the particular look of a man who had been doing something quiet inside and had no particular feelings about being interrupted. He looked at her with the same warmth he had produced at the end of the driveway 3 years ago, which she found briefly disorienting given what she had come to say. "Diane," he said. "Hey, everything okay?" "I wanted to talk to you about the truck," she said. He glanced past her at the F-100 sitting across the street. "What about it?" "It's just..." She had rehearsed several versions of this. None of them had felt quite right, and this moment was confirming that instinct. "It doesn't really fit with the street, Keanu. The neighborhood has a certain people here take a lot of pride in how things look, and a truck like that parked out front to just..." "Is it bothering you?" he said. His voice was not defensive, just direct. "It's not just me. I think a lot of people on the street feel..." "Has anyone else said something?" A pause. "I've spoken to a few people." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to be here about 3 weeks," he said. "The truck is registered and roadworthy. I'm not breaking any rules." He paused. "But I hear you, and I appreciate you coming to say it directly rather than just making calls." He said it without any particular weight on the last part, just stated it plainly. The color that moved across Diane's face was the color of a person who has understood that they have been understood. "I'll keep it in mind," he said. "Thanks for coming over, Diane." He closed the door. Not quickly. Not with any hostility. Just closed it the way a person closes a door when a conversation has reached its natural end. Diane walked back across the street. The truck sat exactly where it had been. What Diane didn't know, and what Leonard Fitch was about to find out, was that the truck had a history that made her complaint feel, in retrospect, like worrying about the frame on a Rembrandt. Gary Pelham found out first. He was not given to unnecessary curiosity in the course of his work. HOA inspection was, by design, a procedural job, and Gary was good at it precisely because he did not editorialize. But something about the truck had stayed with him after his drive-by. The wooden toolbox in the bed particularly. It was old, handmade, the joints fitted with a care that wasn't common. He had photographed it as part of the standard documentation and found himself looking at the photograph that evening in a way that was not professional. He had a friend named Arturo who restored vintage vehicles and knew more about old trucks than anyone Gary had ever met. On a Thursday, 2 days after the initial inspection, he sent Arturo the photographs with a casual message. "You know what this is?" Arturo's response came back in 11 minutes. Asterisk, that's a 73F 100 Ranger XLT. Original paint, which is almost impossible to find in that condition. You see the toolbox in the bed? That's not store-bought. Someone built that by hand, probably the original owner. These trucks were workhorses. Most of them got used until they fell apart. One in this condition means someone cared about it for 50 years. Where'd you find it? Asterisk. Gary looked at the photograph again. The toolbox. The original paint. 50 years of someone caring about a thing. He sent Arturo the address. Arturo drove by that Saturday. He sat in his car across the street for several minutes. Then he knocked on the door of number 14. Keanu answered in the same gray t-shirt. He looked at Arturo, a compact man in his 50s with paint-stained hands and the focused eyes of someone who sees things and objects that other people miss. "I hope you don't mind," Arturo said. "I restore vintage vehicles. My friend Gary sent me some photographs of your truck. I had to come see it in person." Keanu looked past him at the F-100. Something shifted in his expression. Not pride exactly. Something older than pride. "You want to take a look?" he said. They spent 45 minutes with the truck. Arturo asked questions with the careful respect of someone handling something significant. Keanu answered them with a directness that came from genuine knowledge. He knew the truck the way a person knows something they've spent real time with. The engine, the bodywork, the modifications that were original, and the ones that had been added over the decades, and by whom. "Who built the toolbox?" Arturo asked, running his hand along the fitted joints. Keanu was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said. "He built it when the truck was new. He was 17. His father had just bought the truck, and he built the toolbox the first summer he had it." He paused. "The truck came to me when my grandfather passed. I've had it for about 15 years. Arturo looked at the toolbox for a long moment, at the joints, at the wood, which was old and seasoned and had been maintained with the same care as the rest of the vehicle. "Your grandfather kept it all this time," Arturo said. "He drove it every day until he was 81, Keanu said. "Short distances near the end, but every day." Arturo nodded slowly. He looked at the truck the way he looked at all the vehicles he restored, not as objects but as containers of time, of the hands that had been on them, of the roads they had traveled, and the people who had needed them to start in the morning. "This is one of the finest examples of a preserved F-100 I have ever seen," Arturo said. He said it simply, without performance. "Not restored. Preserved. There's a difference. Restored means someone put it back. Preserved means it was never lost." Keanu looked at the truck. "That's right," he said quietly. They shook hands. Arturo drove away slowly, the way a person drives away from something they want to look at a little longer. Arturo told Gary. Gary, who was not given to unnecessary communication in his professional capacity, found himself writing a longer report than usual that Monday morning. He wrote it not as an official HOA document, but as a personal note to Leonard Fitch, which was unusual enough that Leonard read it twice. The note explained what Arturo had told him: the truck's provenance, the original paint, the hand-built toolbox, the grandfather who had driven it every day until he was 81. Gary wrote it plainly, without editorializing, which made it more affecting than if he had tried. He ended the note with a single sentence that he had written and deleted twice before leaving in. "I wanted you to have this information in case it was useful." Leonard Fitch read the note at his desk on a Monday morning. He sat with it for a while. He was not a sentimental man by training or inclination, but he had been raised by a father who had worked with his hands and who had cut things carefully, and who had died when Leonard was 40, leaving behind a workshop full of tools that Leonard had not been able to bring himself to sell. He thought about the toolbox, a 17-year-old building it the summer his father bought the truck, the joints fitted with care. 50 years later, still in the bed, he picked up the phone and called Diane Portfield. The call was brief. Leonard told Diane about the truck's history. He was measured about it, as he was measured about everything, but the facts carried their own weight without needing elaboration. Diane listened. She did not say much. When Leonard finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "There was no reason you would have," Leonard said. Another pause. "I still called the HOA," she said. "It came out half a statement, half as something else." "You did," Leonard said. "Not unkindly. The rules exist for a reason, and you used them. The process worked the way it was designed to. No violation was found." He paused. "What you do with the rest of it is up to you." Diane set the phone down and looked out her kitchen window at the truck. Same green, same honest rust, same wooden toolbox in the bed. She thought about a 17-year-old with his father's new truck and a summer ahead of him, and enough care for something to build at a toolbox that would still be there 50 years later. She thought about an 81-year-old driving every day, short distances near the end. But every day, she thought about what she had said to Leonard in her original complaint. An eyesore, inconsistent with neighborhood standards. She stood at the window for a long time. On Wednesday afternoon, she crossed the street again. She rang the bell at number 14. Keanu answered. Same gray t-shirt, same unhurried expression. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she said. "Sure." They stood on the front step. Diane had not rehearsed this one. It showed, and that was better. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I called the HOA about your truck. Twice, actually. Gary came by and found no violation, and then I called Leonard and pushed. And then I came over here and made it about neighborhood standards, which was..." She stopped, started again. "I didn't know anything about the truck. I just saw something old and decided it was a problem." Keanu looked at her. His expression was the same it had been when she came over the first time. Not warm in a performed way, just present, actually listening. "Leonard told you," he said. "Gary found out from a friend. Leonard told me." She paused. "Your grandfather drove it every day until he was 81. He did." "I'm sorry," she said. "Not because of what I found out. Because I decided something was wrong before I knew anything about it." He was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. He said it simply, without making her wait for it, which she had not expected, and which made it easier to receive. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "The toolbox in the bed. Your father built it." Something moved in Keanu's face. Not grief, not quite. The expression of a person touching something that has weight. "The summer my grandfather bought the truck," he said. "My father was 17. Diane looked at the truck, at the toolbox, which from here she could see clearly. Old wood, careful joints, something built by a teenage boy for his father's new truck 50 years ago. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it with a completeness she had not felt about anything on the street in 3 years. Keanu looked at the truck too. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have moved past something and found, on the other side of it, something unexpectedly real. "I'm going to let you get back to your afternoon," Diane said. "Thanks for coming over," he said. She walked back across the street. The truck sat in the October light, green and honest and still. Word traveled on Maple Glen Drive the way it always did, not through any announcement, but through the particular osmosis of a street where people had lived long enough to notice things. Gary had told Arturo. Arturo had told his wife, who knew 3 people on the adjacent street. Leonard had told his wife over dinner without intending it as something to share, and she had mentioned it to her walking group, 2 members of which lived on Maple Glen. By the end of the week, most of the street knew the story of the truck, or a version of it. The versions varied in their details, as all past stories do. In some tellings, the grandfather had been a farmer. In others, he had driven the truck across the country. The toolbox grew more elaborate with each retelling, though the core of it, a boy, his father's truck, 50 years, stayed intact, which is how you know when the heart of a story is true. The true part survives the passage through other people's mouths. What changed on the street was quiet, and therefore lasting. Marcus Webb at number 22, who had complained to Leonard 3 months prior about the Pattersons' basketball hoop being visible from the street, did not renew that complaint at the next board meeting. He did not explain why. He simply did not bring it up. Ellen Cho at number 9 had been meaning for 2 years to take down the wind chimes her late mother had hung on the front porch, because a neighbor had once mentioned they could be heard faintly from the street. She did not take them down. She had never explained to anyone why she had been considering it, and she did not explain why she stopped. The Pattersons' teenage son, who had watched the whole sequence of events with the focused attention of a 16-year-old trying to understand how adults actually work, asked his father about it one evening. "Why did everyone make such a big deal about a truck?" he said. His father thought about it honestly. "They didn't know what it was," he said. "They just saw something old and decided it was wrong. And when they found out, most of them felt differently. Why didn't they just ask first?" His father looked at him. He was 16, and he had identified the thing that all the adults, including his father, had been circling around without quite landing on. "That's the right question," he said. "I don't have a great answer." The boy nodded and went back to his homework. He was going to be fine, his father thought. Probably better than fine. On the Friday of his 3rd week, Keanu came out of number 14 in the early morning. The street was quiet, the particular quiet of a residential street before it has decided to be awake. He walked to the truck and stood beside it for a moment. He put his hand on the hood, flat-palmed, the way you touch something that has meaning. Then he opened the cab and got in. The engine turned over on the first try. He sat for a moment with the engine idling, looking through the windshield at Maple Glen Drive, at the careful lawns and the washed cars and the houses that represented, each in their own way, someone's idea of a life they had worked toward. He thought about his grandfather, who had had his own idea of a life and had worked toward it in a different kind of place entirely, a smaller house, a working farm, roads that didn't require the truck to look like anything in particular. He thought about the toolbox, his father at 17, with a hammer and wood and the particular ambition of a boy who wants to make something good for someone he loves. The joints that were still tight 50 years later, the things that last when they are built with care. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb. He drove for 2 hours. No destination. The old highways north of a city, the kind that go through small towns and farm country and haven't changed much since the truck was new. The engine ran clean and steady beneath him. The toolbox was in the rearview mirror, small and solid in the bed. He thought about his grandfather on these roads, not the old man at 81, driving short distances near the end, but the younger man, the father of the 17-year-old who built the toolbox, the man who had bought this truck new in 1973 and driven it into his life. He stopped at a diner outside a small town called Vela, ordered coffee and eggs. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with the easy manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to be genuinely interested in people again, looked at the truck through the window. "That yours?" she said. "Yes, ma'am. My daddy had one of those. Green, same as yours." She looked at it for a moment. He drove it until it wouldn't go anymore. Then he parked it in the barn and couldn't bring himself to sell it. She smiled. "Some trucks you just can't sell." "No," Keanu said. "You can't." She refilled his coffee without being asked and went back to her other tables. He sat for a while with the second coffee. Through the diner window, the truck sat in the gravel lot, green in the morning light, unhurried. When he got back to Maple Glen Drive that afternoon, there was something on the hood of the truck. He pulled into the driveway and got out and walked to it. A small card, weighted down by a smooth stone so it wouldn't blow away. Handwritten. He recognized the handwriting as Diane's from the neat way she had signed the neighborhood welcome letter 3 years ago. Asterisk, I looked up the F-100 after we talked. I found a photograph from 1973. A dealer's showroom photo. Same green, same trim. It looked brand new. And I thought about the person who bought it, and I thought about the boy who built the toolbox, and I thought about the 81-year-old driving it every day. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't have a way to say I was wrong that feels like enough. But I wanted you to know I understand something now that I didn't before. Asterisk. It's a beautiful truck. He read it twice. Then he set it on the seat inside the cab, tucked under the sun visor where it would stay flat. He went inside. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the street, which was the same street it had been the morning he arrived and was also, in the way that places change when the people in them change, not quite the same. Leonard Fitch called an optional community meeting the following week. Not about the truck. The truck issue was closed and had been closed from the beginning. He called it because he had been thinking, since reading Gary's note, about something he had not examined in his 7 years as board president. 12 people came. A reasonable turnout for a voluntary meeting on a Tuesday evening. Leonard stood at the front of the community room with his notes and his usual procedural manner, and then, midway through the prepared remarks, set down his notes. I want to say something that isn't in the guidelines, he said. The room waited. The guidelines exist to protect what we've built here. That's their purpose, and I believe in that purpose. But I've been thinking about what it means to protect something. He paused. I think sometimes we use the guidelines to manage things we don't understand, rather than to address things that are actually harmful. And there's a difference between those two uses. He looked around the room, at Marcus Webb and Ellen Cho and the Pattisons, and the 6 other faces watching him. I'm not proposing any rule changes. I'm proposing that we ask, before we file a complaint, whether we've tried to understand the thing we're complaining about, whether we've knocked on a door, whether we've given whatever it is a chance to be explained before we've decided it's a problem. He picked up his notes. That's all. The rest of tonight is regular business. The regular business took 20 minutes. Afterward, as people were putting on coats and gathering bags, Marcus Webb stopped beside Leonard at the door. That was a good thing to say, Marcus said. I should have said it earlier, Leonard said. 7 years earlier, probably. Marcus nodded. He was a man who appreciated directness. Well, he said, you said it. Keanu left Maple Glen Drive on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after he arrived. He loaded one bag into the cab of the truck and one into the bed beside the toolbox. He locked the house. He walked to the truck and stood beside it for a moment in the early light. Across the street, Diane's kitchen window was lit. He could see her silhouette behind the glass, not watching, exactly. Just there, the way people are present in windows in the early morning without particularly meaning to be seen. He raised his hand once. A small, unhurried wave. The silhouette paused, then raised a hand back. He got in the truck. The engine turned over on the first try, as it always did. He sat for a moment, listening to it idle. The clean, steady sound of an engine that had been cared for honestly across 50 years. Then he put it in gear and drove slowly up Maple Glen Drive, past the careful lawns and the washed cars, and turned at the end onto the wider road, and was gone. The space where the truck had been was just a space on the street. By afternoon, there was another car parked there. A silver SUV belonging to a weekend visitor at number 11. Expensive, recently washed, unremarkable. It sat in the same spot the F-100 had occupied and communicated nothing in particular about anyone. But Diane stood at her window that evening and looked at that spot for a while, at the empty space, and what had occupied it. She thought about what Leonard had said at the meeting about understanding things before deciding they were problems. She thought about the toolbox. She thought about the 81-year-old. She thought about what it meant to keep something carefully for 50 years. The daily decision to care for a thing. The faith that the caring mattered even when no one was watching. She had never kept anything for 50 years. She was 54, and she was not sure she had kept anything for more than a decade. She was not sure that was something you could change about yourself, or whether it was something that happened gradually if you paid a certain kind of attention. She made a note to call her mother, which she had been meaning to do for 2 weeks. Gary Pelham drove past number 14, Maple Glen Drive on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the truck had gone. It was a professional habit. He drove his inspection routes on a regular cycle, and Maple Glen was on the route. Everything was as it should be. The house was maintained. The garden was trim. No violations. He paused outside number 14 for a moment longer than the drive-by required. He thought about Arturo's message. One in this condition means someone cared about it for 50 years. He thought about the original paint, the color of old pine, the toolbox joints, the current registration sticker on the plate. He thought about his father's truck on the gravel road in Oregon, how it had started every morning regardless of the weather, and how, when it finally didn't, his father had stood beside it with one hand on the hood for a long time before going inside. He drove on. He had 6 more properties on his route, and it was going to rain by noon. But he drove a little slower than usual that morning, past the houses on Maple Glen Drive, looking at them with a slightly different quality of attention. Not looking for violations, just looking at what people had built and what they kept and what they drove and what sat in their driveways and what it might mean if he took the time to find out about who they were and where they had come from and what they were carrying. It was a small shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself. But Gary had learned, in 20 years of looking at things professionally, that the small shifts were usually the ones that lasted. The rain came in at 11:45. He was back at his office by noon. Arturo called him that evening. He had a line on a 1971 F-100 in a barn in Fresno, he said. Original owner's family, never restored, spent the last 20 years under a tarp. He was driving up Saturday to take a look. "You want to come?" he said. Gary had not gone on one of Arturo's barn finds in years. He had a list of things he should do on Saturday. He thought about the truck on Maple Glen Drive, the original paint, the toolbox. Preserved means it was never lost. "Yeah," he said, "I'll come." He hung up and looked out the window at the rain. Somewhere on a highway north of the city, or south of it, or across a state line, a green 1973 F-100 was moving through the evening. Clean engine, honest rust, a hand-built toolbox in the bed. He thought about the man driving it and the grandfather who had driven it before him, and the boy who had built the box and the grandfather who had bought the truck new and driven it into his life. For people, one truck, 50 years. He turned off his desk lamp and went home.